Food Freedom Radio in Minneapolis. Is this someone known to you, Jordan?
No, Laura, we've not met, but I'm excited that you're present for this chat.
So, and here's David. So we'll wait just a minute more to let a couple more people accumulate. Yep. There's Sage involved in the project.
Hello, Sage.
Hey, everybody.
Hey. We have these seminars, we alternate between noon and 6, which is a little confusing, I think. And of course, people that are working during the day find it hard to log on at 6, but we do this to accommodate time zones so that people, since we are an international organization, and so this allows people from Europe and so on to log on, such as this is Richard there from the UK. Hey, Richard. Okay, let's begin. So Nick Jordan is a professor at the University of Minnesota in agronomy and plant science. And so what is that but artificial genetic evolution? And he has a background, a very distinguished background in basic ecology and population genetics. And with the Forever Green project, of course, he is attempting applied cultural evolution at a grand scale with basically transforming Midwestern agriculture from the industrial variety to something that's more regenerative. And as you'll see, this really confronts us with the fact that cultural evolution can be very complicated and systemic, that if you're going to do this at all, then it has so many moving parts, including, for example, not only continuous cover agriculture, but also the entire economic supply chain that has to go along with it for it to be viable. So this is true for genetic evolution too. If you're going to evolve a strain of perennial crop, for example, that is a multi-trait exercise as far as genetic evolution is concerned, and it's a multi-trait exercise as far as cultural evolution is concerned. So this is a project that's actually already involves a collaboration with Pro-Social World, and so we'll be reporting on that collaboration in progress, several years in progress. And so with that, Nick, thank you so much, and take it away.
Wonderful. So good to be here. And naturally, I want to illustrate my remarks. So let me fire up appropriate PowerPoint business. All right, then. Is everyone able to see a title slide?
Yes.
Great. And David, you'll note the stolen graphic from your book.
Yeah, I like your 2 arrows better than my 1 arrow. So.
All right, then. So what I'm going to tell you about is a big, ambitious project. I don't know how many of you guys have heard the term BHAG, which stands for a big, hairy, audacious goal. And it's just sort of a funny little term, but this is a big, hairy, audacious project, I guess you might say, that aspires to diversify agriculture in the Midwest of the United States at a regional scale. So here is the ground that I'd like to cover together. I'd like to talk to you briefly about what is the rationale, what's the motivation for trying to diversify the agriculture of the Midwest, and then introduce you to this big, hairy, and audacious network called the Forever Green Partnership, and then to try to make it clear why this work might be of interest to the folks that are tuned in to this seminar series, and then to give you a feeling for how things are going. So that's the plan. So let's first of all talk about this notion of regional agricultural diversification. So here's the region, more or less, that we're trying to work in, the so-called Corn Belt of the U.S. And the Corn Belt of the U.S. has experienced a very intense undiversification in the last century or so. So just as a striking little depiction of that, here is a research farm area in the state of Iowa, circa 1941. And the thing to see is there are lots of different colors because there are lots of different kinds of crops, including crops that grow at different times of year, such as oats that grow at a different time of year from corn, and perennial crops such as hay and pastures. So fast forward 35 years, and you can see that there's been a profound homogenization of that agricultural landscape, and that two crops, the green and of corn and the gray of soybeans, are now very predominant. So just to show that what you just saw is actually typical of the dynamic in this Corn Belt region. This is a graph that, as you can see, tracks the distribution of agricultural land use, or land use in general, in a county in Iowa and Osceola County. And what you can see is that in the 1930s, there was a distribution of land uses that had a decent amount of land in at least four kinds of land use categories. And you can watch over the ensuing decades the steady predominance of row crops and the disappearance of almost everything else. So now in our Corn Belt region, we have on average 70 million, or just these are representative figures, something on the order of 70 million acres of corn per year, and something north, somewhat less, but a comparably giant figure of soybean production. And one of the consequences of this is that there now is this kind of ecological problem that extends over well north of 100 million acres in this Corn Belt region, which is that there are only 4 months of living plant cover on the landscape. And why is that? Because those corn and soybean crops only actually are active for about 1/3 of the annual cycle. And the soil otherwise does not have living plants and, very importantly, living roots in the soil. And soil that, if it's not frozen, if it doesn't have a living root in it, it is dying soil, because the fundamental dynamic that maintains soil is the very complex mutualism between the roots of plants and all manner of soil microbes. And so when that mutualism is not functioning, all kinds of bad things happen to soil. So here's a kind of striking graphic depiction of this business of soils being uncovered. So we're focusing on Minnesota here, but this is actually true of the whole Midwest. This is a series of photographs of vegetative activity taken from a satellite. The colors are not what are actually photographed, but nonetheless are representative of vegetative activity. Basically, brown is when you have nothing growing, and the intensity of green shows the intensity of active plant canopies on that landscape. And the thing that I want you to see is that as late into the year as May in the state of Minnesota, and again, this is representative of the Corn Belt in general, we see in the farmed parts of the state, which are sort of to the lower and left-hand sides of that outline of Minnesota, we see nothing but brown, and that represents the lack of any kind of active plant. Even in June, we see only weak plant cover of the region. And it's not until July that we see intense plant cover getting fired up. And come October, it's gone again. So you can see that we have this this very sort of subcontinental scale ecological problem of lack of soil cover. And briefly, let's take a look at the consequences of that. So first of all, in the Midwest of the United States, we have truly world-class soils, and this region is very important to the global food system. It's one of the relatively few global breadbaskets upon which the world food system in many ways depends. And that's a very complex topic, by the way. But anyway, our soils are really great. And we have damaged, unfortunately, unintentionally, our soils pretty substantially. This is a graphic that shows the degree of loss of the fertile part of the soil, the so-called A horizon, measured by a new measurement technique that used satellite imagery that revealed that there had been a lot more soil loss than was thought. All kinds of water problems in the Midwest, stemming from soil erosion, and manifest, for example, in the dead zone of the Gulf of Mexico, manifest in very widespread contamination of rural drinking water by nitrate from nitrogen fertilizer. This growing phenomenon of harmful algal blooms. This is a picture of that in 2017, and this results largely from phosphorus pollution from farmland, as you can see in the upper left or upper right hand corner there. The area of these kind of algal blooms has been growing rapidly. Lots of damage to infrastructure, rivers and places adjacent to rivers due to flooding because of the way that water moves off these uncovered landscapes. Lots of impact on biodiversity, most well known in the case of pollinators, but in fact, there's a pervasive crisis of profound damage to insect biodiversity in all intensive agricultural regions, it appears, and the Midwest is no exception. So there are all kinds of impacts of our current lack of diversification, and these are likely to get worse if climate change goes forward as predicted. So we have a regional sized problem, calls for some sort of regional solution. So how could we conceptualize what we're trying to achieve, what we should be striving for, so what David would call a systemic goal around diversification? Because diversification is a very broad sort of concept. And in the Forever Green Project, we think there's a lot of value in lifting up a concept that we and others call continuous living cover. So we can define that as a kind of agriculture that simply covers farmland with some sort of productive living crop for as much of the annual cycle and as much of the farmed landscape as practical. This is a broad concept, so it includes many different sorts of agriculture that in one way or another achieve or enhance continuous living cover. So this includes agroforestry, growing woody plants and crops together, something called relay cropping, growing a succession of annual crops one after another, so that continuous living cover is achieved. It includes perennial kinds of agriculture, such as grazing systems and perennial crops. So it's a broad notion. And the point being that if we are going to achieve continuous living cover, we must diversify at a regional scale. And just to give you, some images, to give you a feeling, a further feeling for what this concept means, this is continuous living cover being enhanced by several of the crops that the Forever Green Project is developing. More about those crops in a minute. But we're looking at a typical field in the fall season in the upper Midwest after the harvest of summer crops. Exposed soil, very vulnerable to erosion, damage of various kinds, compared to a field of the perennial grain crop Kernza, which more about that in a bit. Or in the spring, what we're looking at is a crop called winter camelina. That's one of those relay crops in which one covers farmland continuously by a sort of relay race of one annual crop after another. So continuous living cover does lots of good things. It restores that fundamental relationship between plants and soil that sustains soil and agriculture and civilization, and does all kinds of other things. The problem is that in the current economics of farming, it isn't clear how that could be viable. And so this is a very important issue that the Forever Green Partnership tries to address. And by the way, this is this attractive backdrop for this picture is a field of this perennial grain crop called intermediate wheatgrass, or Kernza, growing in Minnesota. So there are some large-scale dynamics that suggest opportunities to figure out an economics for continuous living cover. The world is starting to demand of agriculture that it start to switch from being kind of a problem in terms of climate, vulnerability to climate, contribution to climate change, to becoming a solution to those two things: societal vulnerability to climate change and the ongoing driving of climate change. Society is starting to demand that, and we see firms like Cargill responding to that. Society is not just demanding action from agriculture around climate. Society is demanding action around what's often called regenerative agriculture, i.e. agriculture that can help rebuild water, soil, biodiversity. So we see these major firms responding to that societal pressure, be they Cargill, be they General Mills, be they Walmart, which naturally is doing it on the largest scale of all in terms of the pledges that they've made. So the question that we are asking as we ponder how we can figure out an economy for continuous living cover, the answer, we think, is to achieve continuous living cover through crops that produce things that the world wants and needs. And this is my colleague and co-conspirator of many decades out here in Minnesota, Don Wise, my colleague in my academic department here, holding up a box of breakfast cereal produced by Cascading Farms, which is a brand of General Mills climate smart Kernza grains produced by grain from that field that you saw before. And so the thing that I want to emphasize is that pathways to achieving continuous living cover have, none of them have been successful in the Midwest. And the ones that have been tried mainly involve achieving continuous living cover through things called cover crops, which you may or may not have heard of cover crops, but a cover crop by definition is something that you don't harvest anything from in terms of an agricultural commodity, a biomaterial or a food product. Rather, you grow the cover crops to take care of soil and make soil healthier, but you don't harvest something from it. And the economics of that in the current economics of agriculture have not been favorable, and people have tried hard to extend cover cropping over the Midwest for decades without moving the needle very much at all. And so the whole premise of the Forever Green Project is that we should pursue regional diversification, we should pursue continuous living cover by developing a set of crops that produce commodities that the world wants and needs. That's the idea. So for Evergreen, our project can be described as an effort to build market-driven pathways to continuous living cover agriculture in the Midwest. And this involves developing a portfolio of new winter hardy and perennial crops that have, first of all, the ability to play well with the agriculture that we have in the Midwest right now, which, as you know, is built on 2 summer row crops for the most part. And also, these crops have potential to produce things that the world wants and needs, like, say, sustainable aviation fuel, and or breakfast cereals that make people who are worried about climate change feel like they're voting with their pocketbook for the future they want. So the general idea is that these crops produce things that the world wants, creating new economic opportunities associated with diversification, and producing a wide range of environmental benefits, or ecosystem services, as we call them. So let me introduce you to the crops briefly. They are of 3 sorts: perennial crops that are not woody, and these include that Kernza intermediate wheatgrass perennial grain, and a number of others, some of which are ancient crops like alfalfa that, however, are being developed for new uses, like directly eating protein from alfalfa without the mediation of a cow, for example, by people. Others are de novo domestications, like silphium, a crop that is a native prairie perennial crop that colleagues of ours and now our plant breeders here at the University of Minnesota are developing from scratch as a crop. We also have a portfolio of winter annual crops that are suitable for that relay cropping technique that I mentioned, in which you follow one annual crop by another to keep something growing for the whole annual cycle. So these include a couple of so-called winter hardy oilseed crops, pennycress and camelina. They, like soybean, produce both oil and protein, and they're both of much interest now that the world is seeing the necessity of low carbon transport fuels. But we have a number of others as well in development, and there's also a portfolio of native woody crops. So these are all meant to be crops that in one way or another play well with our summer annual crops and fit into places where we're either not growing those crops, like fall, winter, and spring, or places where we shouldn't be growing those annual crops, like on slopes. And in fact, we cannot grow those crops profitably on slopes, and outsized amounts of environmental damage happens when we grow summer annual crops on slopes for the most part. So having these perennial crops for those kinds of positions within an agricultural landscape where it makes no good sense to grow annual row crops, that's how they all sort of fit together. Just to sort of underscore this, the point is that by providing continuous living cover, many environmental benefits or ecosystem services are provided that range from the protection of drinking water, which is a problem throughout the rural Midwest, nitrate contamination in drinking water, addressing the equally pervasive and systemic contamination of lakes and streams throughout the Midwest, managing nutrients so they stay on farms and get into crops and not into the atmosphere and water, providing pollinator and wildlife habitat, in some cases storing significant amounts of carbon, protecting soil from erosion and building its health, and also managing weeds and other pests. So there's a whole suite of environmental benefits that are provided. And what essentially monetizes, or rather finances, the provision of those benefits to society are the products. So the world is looking now for oils, low carbon vegetable oils for sustainable aviation fuel and other purposes, new sources of fiber for biomanufacturing and all sorts of other things, new sources of protein. We're in the middle of a intense questioning of protein nutrition in the human food supply. The future of animal agriculture and animal sources of proteins is being intensely debated, as you know. So new sources of plant protein are very important. New kinds of phytonutrients to increase the overall healthfulness of our diets are very important. So let me just briefly show you a few of these crops. Here is this perennial grain crop, which is the world's first perennial grain crop for the temperate zone, intermediate wheatgrass or kernza. This is that winter hardy oilseed winter camelina. On the left there, you see it flowering in May here in Minnesota. Pennycress is a similar crop, also winter hardy, also an oilseed. Winter and hybrid winter rye is a very high yielding winter crop that again plays well with our summer crops to achieve that continuous living cover. Winter barley is something that our plant breeders are just now perfecting, but provides yet another option for this relay cropping business. Winter hardy field peas are coming along and along with spring pea provide other opportunities for moving towards continuous living cover. Hybrid hazelnuts are one of our woody perennial crops. And here's that silphium crop that I mentioned before. Okay, so that's the vision for regional diversification by scaling up continuous living cover with crops that produce things that the world wants and needs. And we have some crops, have a bunch of crops that we think have good potential. And we are working very hard to improve those crops and also improve our understanding of how to make things from them that the world wants to buy. But actually scaling up any given crop, let alone a whole sort of transformative concept of agriculture, is certainly not something that can be done by the research enterprise in society. It requires much more investment and a much more broadly scaled collective action than that. And this is why it is necessary that there's something like the Forever Green Partnership to exist and try to do that. So Forever Green Partnership is a public-private and NGO partnership that is working to scale up continuous living cover agriculture. And just so everybody knows what I mean by scale up, what this would mean would be achieving it over tens of millions of acres in this Midwest agriculture that we have that spans somewhere north of 120 million acres or so. And this is truly a big, hairy, audacious goal, a BHAG, and it's going to take more than 3 to 5 years, but I couldn't figure out how to remove that from this graphic. Let me tell you conceptually, and here's where we start to verge away from possibly interesting matters of agriculture into things that are more at the heart of what pro-social world and its friends think about and work for, I think. Let me share with you the underlying theory of how we do this. So a key premise is that multi-sector and crucially multi-scale networks can actually drive transformational change in the major life support systems of society. And what I'm showing you is a little infographic of the famous multi-level perspective theory of this Dutch guy, Frank Giels, and others, and what their historical work, essentially studying transformative change in life support systems of society, say water systems, energy systems, shows is that transformative change occurs rarely and with great difficulty. And so ordinarily, these life support systems are very stable and strongly resist change. However, transformative change can occur when what we can conceptualize as top-down and bottom-up pressures coincide. So top-down pressures are the pressures that society as a whole is putting on one of these life support systems. And in this conceptual framework, these are called regimes. So we can think of Midwest agriculture as a regime. And the regime has many different complementary components, which you can see there. So a whole R&D system symbolized by the land-grant universities of the Midwest, a supportive culture, supportive finance, supportive policy, and expectations of the world for what their food will consist of and look like. And these things all create a very stabilized, complex, and very adaptive indeed system that is able to resist pressure, mostly. But when the society as a whole is saying strongly and in many different ways, regime, your performance now is not satisfactory, then the regime is under pressure. And if bottom-up pressure, which consists of basically a viable alternative to the regime, something different, is also occurring. In other words, we have a demand by society as a whole for the regime to change, and there's something that it can actually change to, then the scholarship of Giels and others shows that that's when things do change. So our strategy in our working hypothesis in the Forever Green Partnership is that we should attempt to actually orchestrate this joint pressure that can be conceptualized as top-down and bottom-up. So here we can think of food companies as being a significant part of the current regime of Midwest agriculture. And these companies are clearly under pressure from all manner of sectors, NGOs, regulators, investors, media, to change. That's why there's, among other reasons, I'm sure that's why they are saying, they're making pledges about, yes, they will become more climate smart and so on. Down in the bottom-up world, we have a whole constellation of folks that are working together to come up with an alternative to our current Midwest agriculture. That's what we are calling continuous living cover agriculture. So our strategy in the Forever Green Partnership is that we need to do both top-down work to try to put pressure on the existing regime in a friendly way for the most part, and also bottom-up work, which I'll tell you about in a second. So the top-down work involves policy ideation, identifying policy pathways, that doing cross-sector policy design work, essentially, to support continuous living cover agriculture. It involves some very active politics that is, by the way, not a zero-sum game type politics, but is a politics that is trying to construct broad collective action that brings people together and groups together across lines of differences. And we believe, among other things, that this is something that agricultural scientists have to roll up their sleeves and get into the middle of. Strategic communication, the broad sort of storytelling about the world and how it's going and what agriculture is doing and what agriculture could do. That's an important form of top-down work. The world of finance is also a very important part of the top-down. It's a very important part of how society shapes any sector, and actively engaging with finance innovators is an important form of top-down work that we do as well. So we do a lot of top-down work in the Forever Green Partnership. We do bottom-up work because the top-down work is kind of pointless if there isn't a viable alternative that the regime could evolve into. So our bottom-up work is basically building on the crops that I have just showed you some of, and working with what we call co-innovators to create pilot supply chains. Pilot supply chains are pilot scale viable alternatives to our current agricultural systems. And so the essence of this bottom up work is that we integrate crops and what we can call co-innovations and try to scale these and see what we learn. Key premise of that is that what actually scales when our fundamental life support systems shift are not individual technologies. They are bundles of co-innovations. In short, I'll just read you the little quote. If we're going to scale up innovations like new crops, we must achieve a conducive policy, financial, social, and business environment. And if they're not present, we must innovate to create or improve those conditions. And this is all grounded in contemporary understanding of innovation, which is that innovation is not when you come up with a new widget, but rather when you combine the new widget with, which we can think of as hardware, with other kinds of innovation, particularly social type innovations and economic innovations. So this illustrates the problem that we need to address. So for our Kernza grain crop, in order to really make this a legitimate functional crop, we not only have to come up with a viable crop, that's work of plant breeding and that's work of agronomy, figuring out how to grow crops, but we also have to engage with supply chains that are downstream from farms. So a whole new logistics needs to be developed to collect these new crops from farms and move them down a supply chain to develop some sort of product and get them to consumers. And so a whole sweep of innovation is required. And this is listed in the little gray boxes on the right side there. So not just genetic innovation, not just agronomic innovation, that's what we do in my Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics, but all kinds of other innovation are required. So bundling together these the crop innovations and supportive co-innovations to build these prototypic systems prototypic alternatives to the status quo that we call pilot supply chains are a really key thing that we do. So pilot supply chains, as we are sort of practicing them, can be thought of as crop clusters of farms that are growing a particular crop. Once we establish that, we find that we incentivize other players to co-innovate. We also incentivize investors, and we learn a lot about what we need to make better about not just the crops, but the whole system. So an example of this has to do with something that we're working on now around one of our crops, hazelnut. So we are trying to scale up this crop in the upper Midwest with a whole bunch of innovations that we think are necessary. So a crop stewardship model, which is a new model of owning intellectual property that suffice it to say is sort of a for-benefit concept, if you're familiar with for-benefit corporations. And a bunch of other innovations that I won't sort of discuss with you, but the point is that to scale up these crops, we need to put these bundles of innovations together into these so-called pilot supply chain projects. And I'm going to skip over this and now turn to why am I talking to you folks about this? We think that there's considerable value in thinking about the bottom up and top down work that we do as a multi-level system that is intended to drive a process of conscious, collective, concerted cultural evolution. And so, inspired by a number of theoretical sources, some of which are listed on this slide. The general idea is that in a multi-level system that is meant to drive cultural evolution, it's necessary to have some sort of process of selection that selects for variation. And so there must be some system that produces variation. And there must be some system for replicating that variation and also continuing variation. So these are the basic elements of any kind of evolution, but that involves selection. And so let's talk about how that's actually implemented in the Forever Green scaling system. Again, the point here is to integrate what I've called top-down work and bottom-up work into essentially drive a process of conscious and collective cultural evolution. So the partnership is all about the actual things that it does to make this happen, crucially experimentation, learning, and focusing resources. And the general hypothesis is that this system will be seen as effective, essentially, in addressing our fundamental problems in the Midwest that I've talked to you about, and therefore attract growing participation and an investment. And we have, in fact, an ongoing collaborative research project with Pro-Social World to broadly test this hypothesis. So let me tell you about how this system works. It works essentially by various interactions between levels in this multi-level system. So on the one hand, a key part of it is something we call the Steering Council, which is a multi-sector group composed of thought and action leaders. They have joined this Steering Council on the premise that they view continuous living cover agriculture as having a lot of potential to address key problems in their sectors. And therefore, they are willing to work to help scale it. And they are willing to work to specifically to obtain resources from their various sectors and therefore to support continuous living cover agriculture. And so the idea is that a pool of resources is being assembled that can be used for the selection part of a conscious cultural evolution process. There is another level in the multi-level system that we call various things, but let's call it an agricultural diversification network. This is a guild, essentially, of persons that are professional scalers of continuous living cover agriculture, some of whom are employed by the University of Minnesota. Others are working all across the Midwest in a number of different organizations. So this is a group of roughly 15 persons. They are dedicated to learning together how this very difficult work of scaling up viable systems, supply chains, let's just call them, to advance continuous living cover. How can that work? And crucially, they have painfully won knowledge that they can share. And it's crucial that they do that. So there's important interactions here. The Steering Council is supposed to come up with a strategic goal. In other words, what kind of continuous living cover are they willing to work for? Are they willing to pool their resources to support? And that group has done so. And importantly, for example, it has come to the decision that equity and inclusion and justice will be key goals in scaling up continuous living cover agriculture, as well as simply covering farmland with continuous living cover. So, that's an important part of, again, what David would call the systemic goal that is necessary for conscious cultural evolution to go forward. The Diversification Network is in a position to share from their painfully won knowledge, created in many cases by intense deliberative discussions, what they can recommend. So they are essentially saying, look, to advance towards the systemic goal for continuous living cover that you have articulated and that you're willing to work for, you should invest in this, this, and this. That, of course, is selection at work. Finally, we have a level in this system of crop R&D groups and scalers that are associated with each of these crops. And these folks are implementing these crops, developing these crops and implementing them on the ground. The scalers belong to that middle network. And again, there's an important interchange. The R&D and scalers shares their innovations. Essentially, what they've learned is they try to bundle the crops and other innovations. And the network allows learnings to be identified and shared back down to that R&D level. So you can see there's a system at work that jointly is capable of exerting selection on variation and also capable also of replication. And so there's the potential, at least, for this whole system to engage the power of conscious cultural evolution to try to scale CLC agriculture. Let me finish up with a few brief observations about how it's going. So the R&D work is very robust. We're turning out new continuous living cover crops that function decently, agronomically, produce things the world wants and needs well. We have a very active group of scalers that try to draw on some of the theories that I've shared and others to motivate their work. And this is a pretty robust crew of folks. These are just the folks that are directly employed by the University of Minnesota to do this work. And let me share a few reflections, and then we can have a brief discussion. So reflection number one is that actually building a multi-level system is intensely relational. It's intensely dialogical and deliberative, and it is slow. So we've been trying to build this multi-level system for, let's say 4 years now. And an enormous amount of relational work, in other words, building and maintaining relationships of trust and collaboration has been necessary. An enormous amount of dialogue has been necessary because different folks view the multi-level system in different ways. And it's an enormous amount of dialogue and deliberation has been necessary to make our way along. Specifically, the individual levels in the system have to be organized. So the steering council, that intermediate learning network, the crop R&D network, those are all require internal organization, if you will. And as well, the multi-level system needs to be organized. And patience and stamina appear to be key, and remains to be seen, I guess, if we have enough patience and stamina, but we're trying. One very important thing is that we are starting to develop a shared understanding of the multi-level system as a whole. And I'll close with this image, which was first shared in a meeting yesterday. And what it shows significantly is that the three different levels, not exactly the same three levels as I showed you, but this will serve to show you our progress. Each of them has defined a give and a get in as to what they are giving to the multi-level system and what they have to get back from the multi-level system. And those of you who are familiar with Ostrom's core design principles will recognize this sense of what are the gives and the gets that any entity that belongs to a cooperative system must know what it's expected to give and what it will get, whether that's an individual person or an organization or networks in a multi-level system of networks, which is what we're looking at here. So I'm going to leave it at that. And I've gone on a little longer than I intended, but let me just get myself back here. And see, I need to stop my sharing. Hold on a second. But I would love to hear any thoughts, comments, questions, any other reaction.
So that was so outstanding, so comprehensive, Nick. It's my policy not to be the first one to comment, and so but there's so much to say. So let's raise your hands, your virtual hands, to form a queue, and I will be the fourth to comment. And I know that Sage is going to have something to say because he's one of the people that's involved in the collaboration.
Great. And I should mention that I will have to leave just a bit after noon and run upstairs to this other thing. David, I don't know if you saw my note about that yesterday.
Okay, fine. That would be fine, just when you need to.
So we'll have some quick discussion.
Yeah, now when is it exactly that you need to leave?
Let's say 3 minutes after noon. How about that?
Okay, 12:03. And then we can stay on a little bit afterwards, not necessarily to the half hour. So good to know that. And then Sage, knowing that, would you like to just contribute a little bit to our end of this collaboration?
Sure. So we're working at kind of two levels, I would say. One at that high coordinating steering level, trying to help those steering councils and ourselves understand, have a comprehension of the system, because without that comprehension of a complex system, it's like shooting in the dark. You don't really know what's going to happen. That is hard, and it's the ongoing dream. And then there's another local level of just a specific group that we've engaged in the uplands driftless region, which is the area of the very unique area of land that the Ice Age glaciers never reached, even though they came again and again, they never reached. And it has created this very fertile Appalachian-like land in the otherwise quite flat Midwest.
Which is a tremendous hotspot of soil loss in that map, I will just point out.
Right. And so with great bounty comes the ability to abuse. But one area we're focused on is with a particular group in this whole network, Grasslands 2.0, and looking at sustainable meat production. And one of the approaches we've just been taking in collaboration with our partner, Sarah Lloyd, is convening this interested group of people to get this complex systems comprehension, to identify basically differing incentives between, in this case, there's the farmers, the suppliers of the producers of meat, and then the processors that actually turn that into a product. And the incentives are not necessarily aligned. The dynamics are difficult. Not everybody's in the room. And we're trying to first map out what are the pain points, and also to hopefully get to a point where we can bring the different stakeholders into a shared kind of understanding, and bit by bit. So there's like a comprehension piece of all of this, and then there's like a facilitation piece of all of this. Do we understand what's going on? And then given that understanding, Can we actually come up with some solutions to these problems? I would say we're in between those two pieces right now.
Wow, yeah. That's great. Sarah, I see that you're on the call. I wonder if you would like to contribute, not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, well, and I also have to go to the same thing that Nick has to go to, so I apologize about that. But yeah, I mean, it's been great to work. We're working with Ian and Sage to sort of figure out how to link the fine level detail of the actual logistical problems of getting animals from pasture to plate, but then, you know, really understanding that we need that culture of collaboration, especially when it's going to perhaps span across enterprises that have competitive, may see themselves in competition. So it's good. And I appreciate it very much.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, so with that in mind, I guess maybe I can pop in if I don't see any hands raised. That I have two questions. I'll ask them both. Oh, gotcha. Saya, please.
I'm so sorry. That was poorly timed. Do you want to go first, David?
No, please.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for the presentation, Nick. I'm curious to know more about that steering group that you described. I work a lot with corporates, and I often find that in these systems, there's a big translation error between people with pots of money to give out or spend on initiatives like this, and then the ability of initiatives to appear investable in the language that can be understood by those funders. So I'm curious from your experience, what that dynamic has been like. Who are the actual corporates that are participating in these conversations? How are they showing up? Are you finding that you're having to do a lot of kind of interpretation across these different silos, or are they naturally getting it? Anything that you can share would be amazing.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Saya. So first of all, there are no corporates on the steering council. There are a couple of retired corporate folks. Yeah, Sarah, great. I'll be there in a minute. There are a couple of retired folks, but we do have some engagement with players like General Mills and Cargill in some of our pilot supply chain work. So that is where we have been able to have that engagement. It is the work of trying to build a system like this is such terra incognita that we have not tried to recruit. Well, we have tried a little bit, but we don't think that. So we think that retired but very well connected representatives of that world are actually better members of the steering council than folks that are actually on the clock. I'll put it that way.
Okay.
Thanks, Nick.
Well, Nick, I don't want to keep you late for the meeting, so why don't you drop off? I'm not going to ask a complicated question with only 15 seconds to answer. So, thank you very much. And of course, this is recorded, and this is all part of the accumulating work that we're doing. Really nice to have this as an introduction, along with our conversation, which is already on T-Ball, and we'll provide a link to that. So why don't you hop off, and then we can stay just a little bit longer to see if anyone wants to comment in your absence, and then we'll call this good. How about that?
All right, you can say what you really think.
Yeah, that's right. We're going to talk behind your back now.
Hey, thanks so much. It's really a pleasure, and
always
I wish
a
you all a
pleasure.
good day.
And you're so articulate. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing.
Thank you. Adios.
Yeah, so I'll just make a couple of points, and Sage or anyone else, you can chip in. But one of the points I wanted to make had to do with the inner work that's needed. We often talk about inner and outer, and so in some ways we need to change our worldview, and we need to, and the overarching kind of multi-level worldview. If you have that, then you just see the world differently. So how much progress could be made on that front? And then secondly, almost the opposite, when we turn to the outer world and we're talking about systemic change, at some point we need a whole modeling apparatus in order to do that. So when we change something, what is the system level consequences of that? And so some kinds of social accounting and social modeling is going to need to come into it. That's why Elizabeth Castillo's course on social accounting, which began this week, is exciting. And so inner and outer. Sage, do you want to make a stab at that, or anybody else as
Yeah.
to what's?
What I can relate it to one of the stakeholder groups that I was mentioning, this Grasslands 2.0 initiative, and particularly the Uplands Driftless region. So I think in talking, it's it's a very academic way to say that there are differing incentives between processors and producers, but underneath those differing incentives is a history and all kinds of relationships, many of which are not that healthy or distrusting or tense or just not aligned. And the alignment of incentives is like a systemic goal, but it's not going to happen if there's not a change in the inner sense as well. If people actually don't identify with each other and trust each other, that's really what's missing. And on the other hand, it's not all doom and gloom at all. There are positive relationships, and but they're on the individual processor level. These are like people, these ones we trust, these ones we don't. So it's very real and personal. And although we're thinking about this massive system, the real leverage points come down to like the very personal relationships and lives that people are living. So it's actually for me often kind of mind-blowing to really try to wrap it's not unlike thinking about how our cells make us in the way that you think of like a given producer and processor here contributing to this multi-state supply chain. Like the dynamics of that are wild. So I mean, this whole project I think is at the level that we need.
Yeah, and it's my experience with this project that we began, at least I did, thinking that we'd waltz in with our core design principles and our ACT matrix. We'd find it easy to engage in groups and it would just build from there. And what actually happened was different than that. And I think it was not so easy to engage groups at any level of those multi-level pictorial of NICs. And Scott, Sage, maybe you could just address that a little bit. Why is it not easier to introduce yourself to a group at any one of these scales and then to quickly begin to use what we think of as our practical tools? Why is it not as easy as that?
Well, I'll say first why it is easy, when it does work, which is when you actually are a part of the system. So the only reason that us, pro-social world, have in our very remote way made any impact or have any real play in the story is because of Sarah, who actually lives in Wisconsin and is meeting with people in the police house once or twice a month. That's the only reason why anything's happening. And so that's a key piece. And I think it's just the sense of buy-in of like whether, like, it's a pretty tall tale for us to really say that this is the moment, this is the relationship that people should put their time in that's gonna make an impact. And so I think it takes just like it just takes time to build up from very, very local problems and to start to like nest those with higher level outcomes. But you can't start at the higher level and say, look, we all want this massive sustainable supply chain. That might get people in the room, but if then you just stay at that level, the problem they have the next day is a much more practical one that's related to that. And so I think that's sort of where we were able to pivot and start the other way around and build up to these higher level relationships. And it started to work because there are active groups that are starting to meet. A co-op, an actual legal co-op has formed. So with that, we get the infrastructure that they can take us more seriously because they're the ones leading the charge. So it's a relationship thing, I think, more than anything.
Yeah, let me pause and see if anyone else wants to contribute.
I'll just say that I love the whole, the whole concept of, what you're doing. I guess one of the, I don't know if anybody else has seen the movie, The Biggest Little Farm.
Yeah, I have.
So it's kind of reminds me of that, trying to, and the things that they went through initially, that kept like not working and stuff falling apart, and, all different sorts of
Yes.
unintended things, and, gophers showing up and dealing with the foxes and, whatever. And it all ends up, coming together kind of harmoniously and all working. But I can sort of see that sort of thing happening in a system like this, somebody trying to do something different kind of crop, different rotation, something rather, and unintended stuff happens. But, over time, there'll be a lot of learning and good ideas that will come out of it, and systems will come out that, that actually do work and work really well. I guess from my perspective too, what I guess I'm thinking is trying to do a lot in a little tiny place sometimes works a lot better than trying to do a little bit across a wide thing. And then once you get that little bit working like really, really well, people will clue and go like, what are you guys doing over there? How does that work? And then now they're open to hearing stuff and that sort of thing. So
Yeah, this is called positive deviance is one word for it. And find what works and promote that. It's already embedded within the system, and so that's better than trying to waltz in as a stranger, as Sage was saying. And this whole narrative of bottom up meets enlightened top down. I was really happy to have Nick showcase that, which is true for almost all of our projects. That's what we're trying to achieve. But it's still my understanding that the enlightened top-down capacity of their steering council is not that great. In other words, what you could have is you could have some top-down agency really in a position to give grants or something like that, substantial resources to bottom-up units, and then to have a process whereby that gets decided and so on and so forth. But it's unless I'm mistaken, for all that exists there, is at least not like that. For all those giant corporations and things like that, there's not a situation where people just say, oh, apply here for block grants and, so on and so forth. Is that right, Sage? Or because that's pretty straightforward and what we try to achieve in other contexts with some of our other projects.
Yeah, I mean, the fun idea is that this top-down acts as an explicit force of selection, basically looking across the whole landscape and trying to fund and support those projects that are really in the right direction. But yeah, there's top down, but it's really hard work getting to enlightened. And that's part of the project is, just simply comprehending it. And there's also, we can't forget that the groups that are in these steering committees are groups themselves trying to figure out what's our role and how do we actually play into this. And so it's not necessarily obvious what they can do that is, even if they're much more nested in the system, that isn't also kind of like off base. We need to invent new institutions in many ways, new expectations. Where do I apply for grants? Where do I find information? What are the standards? What are the policies? I mean, what are the relationships? So there's so much groundwork to be done that it's hard to really say right now where we're at in the process. But I think Gavin had it right. It's the success, the little stories that start to pave the way forward. Until it starts happening, it's all just abstract.
Yeah,
I think kind of building on that, something that's standing out to me, coming into this talk, I will say I didn't read a lot of the bio. Ian just sent it to me and I was excited. I thought it was going to be a cool talk about how we're going to diversify agriculture, very tangible steps that we're going to take as humans. But what stood out to me was, the power of interdisciplinary action and quality communication, to be able to function both top down and bottom up at the same time requires people who are able to think in the middle, who are able to organize groups and inspire action, but to be able to speak in ways that the different groups will actually hear what you're saying, to take information from one group and almost translate in a way where you're using the buzzwords, you're addressing the goals that group has and finding ways to match needs and yields. That's what stood out to me the most.
Yeah, great points. Great points, indeed. Yeah, this is hard work. Really hard work. and rewarding. So anyhow, that's great. Would anyone else like to? The chats have been really good. If
I'm
Evangeline,
curious if
would you like to
anyone.
check-
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Sayaf. We have a habit of speaking at the same
Competing,
time.
yeah, unpredictably.
But then also, I was going to invite Evangeline also, but please.
Yes, great.
Go ahead.
So I am curious about the carbon sequestration aspect of this. I think that was one of the sort of deeper down the list bullet points that flashed up on one of the slides. Is that something that you're finding you can get credits for or monetize in any way already at this stage, or is it more of a hypothesis still?
I think that's a Nick question, unfortunately.
All right, thanks anyway.
I'd say I think there are ways to measure the carbon sequestration. I've got a friend of mine who's got a company that's working on carbon sequestration stuff in California with wood chips. So in California they're cutting down a lot of stuff to prevent fires and things like that, and then so he's got a system where he's just gathering up all the stuff's got everybody bringing the stuff to his place, and he's growing fungi in the wood chips, and then the fungi are root systems, mycelia, are driving the carbon deep down into the ground, and then but now it's and he's trying to get grants right now to be able to actually measure that. So what's it like before he does that, what's it like after a year or two of that, and what happens when all that material is scooped up and then spread. He sells it to people who put it along their grapevines for their wineries because it also helps hold the moisture in, so that you don't have to irrigate the vineyard. He's got vineyards that he runs also, and they don't have to irrigate any of that, even in some of the big droughts. So that's a good bottom up. That's good bottom up. Evangeline, not to put you on the spot, but would you like to speak what you were putting in the chat?
Kind of looks like their microphone might not be connected.
Right. Okay. Well, this has been awesome, and thank you everyone for coming. And please make a habit. Each and every seminar is great, and so we continue along all these multiple fronts. And isn't it amazing? We could be doing this in the context of regenerative agriculture. We could be doing it in the context of the Charter for Compassion, Deep Transformation Network, conscious capitalism, just to mention the people in this room. So how cool is that? Okay, everyone, off we go. Bye-bye.